Now, the self-fascination of the Canberra bubble has been on full display this week. I've talked about it a bit. Real mainstream issues have hardly had a look in, have they? But just to show you how our politicians tend to talk the talk but often not walk the walk, let me walk you through some of the events this week. You'll remember both the Prime Minister and the Opposition Leader responded to a report into sexual harassment, abuse and assaults in Parliament House by offering apologies. They each promised to implement all 28 recommendations of the Jenkins report and change the culture of Parliament.
We owe it to all of those who work in this building. We owe it to all of those who strive to work in this building in the future. And we owe it to the Australian people, who we all have the good grace and great privilege to serve.
Let us be the example for Australia that the National Parliament ought to be.
All wonderful stuff, of course. All this was triggered by the alleged rape of Brittany Higgins in an alcohol-fuelled late-night episode in Parliament House. Debate has identified the strange working environment at Parliament House, the late nights and the drinking on the job. And the Jenkins report addressed these issues. Recommendation 27 is about reviewing Parliament's sitting calendar and business hours to avoid these stresses and strains. And recommendation 28 is all about introducing alcohol policies, trying to restrict its availability to boost workplace health and safety. So there's the apologies and the promises to implement those changes. But what happened the next night? The very next night. Well, the House of Representatives sat all night to pass the Religious Discrimination Bill. All night. These MPs who'd been there from Wednesday morning were there until 4 a.m. Thursday morning and due to be back again there in a few hours later. These are precisely the sort of crazy hours that need to be addressed. And there was further controversy. South Australian Liberal MP James Stephens missed a crucial vote at about 3:30 a.m. Eyewitnesses have told me he was found drunk and asleep on his office floor and had to be helped into the chamber. Stephens denies he was drunk but admitted to the Adelaide Advertiser that he fell asleep. People trying to claim I sawed myself for being ridiculous. It patently did not happen, he said. I came back to my office just for a bit of a break from the chamber and unfortunately that led to me missing a vote, which I do regret. Now, this has nothing to do directly with sexual harassment and abuse issues, of course, but it goes directly to the working environment and culture of Parliament. And those recommendations 27 and 28 in the Jenkins report are aimed precisely at eliminating all-night boozy sittings and all that can flow from them. There was bipartisan agreement on committing to those recommendations and backslapping about cultural change on Tuesday, but Parliament was back to its old self the very next day. And they wonder. Joining me now is Liberal Senator for Victoria, Sarah Henderson. Good to talk to you again, Sarah. You wouldn't have been in the House of Reps, of course, in those early hours, but isn't this just a classic example? Parliament was talking about stopping all that on Tuesday, and you have apparently a booze-addled late-night sitting the very next day.
Well, Chris, good afternoon. Great to join you. And with the greatest of respect, Chris, I don't accept the premise of the question. I don't have any knowledge of these allegations. I've heard what James has had to say. But even if anyone was drinking, to describe it as a booze-addled sitting, I don't think is at all accurate.
Well, if you fall asleep on the floor and miss a vote, that's more than a tipple, and that is the claim which he denies.
Well,
of course.
James does not accept that is truthful at all, and I have heard nothing about that whatsoever. But you do raise an important point. It's one that I've raised before and many of our colleagues have also raised, and that is the responsible consumption of alcohol, and it is one that we take very seriously. The Jenkins report recommendations we take very seriously. The government is working through those as part of a multi-party task force. So there are some very serious issues, but frankly, I'm not so much concerned about the Canberra bubble, Chris. I'm concerned about all Australians, our health, our economic recovery, getting Australia back on track, caring for those who most need our help, and making sure that we do the job that Australians elected us to do.
That's what worries me about the government's focus at the moment. There was all this internal wrangling over the religious discrimination bill, now talk of leaks from Cabinet about the tactics. And yet, while you'll understand that it's a difficult issue, the parliamentary process is pretty fraught on an issue like this, to me it's an issue that really is not of a key concern to most Australians. It's an area that where Australians have lived on a federation for 120 years and religious discrimination has not been a problem. Doesn't the government need to get back to the real issues confronting the country?
Well, Chris, that's just not the case. Many Australians have suffered religious discrimination, and that's why our government made the vow that it did to combat religious discrimination. In fact, I remember my grandfather, a Catholic, telling me a story. He couldn't get a loan when he was a young man because the bank would not loan to Catholics. So many Australians have lived through some form of discrimination, some of it historical and some of it current. And so it has been a strong commitment of our government to
Well, it has. But if I could interrupt, I mean, I agree with you. There was some sectarian discrimination back in the day. And my parents have told me about what the discrimination they faced as Catholics. But that's kind of beyond us now. You needed a religious discrimination bill back then. What is the evidence that there's a real pressing problem now?
Well, Chris, I ran one of the inquiries into the religious discrimination bill, and we heard very extensive evidence of religious discrimination, not just, of course, Christianity, they're from Jewish organisations, from Muslim organisations. There is, amongst some Australians, deep concern about religious discrimination, like other forms of discrimination. Look, it's been a difficult week. Of course, the legislation didn't get through, but we remain committed to the bill and we will work through the issues together, and I hope in a bipartisan way.
Thanks so much for joining us, Senator. I appreciate it.